And we looked at a passage in the book of Mark where two of Jesus' disciples say, this is James and Andrew, can we sit with you at your right and your left hand? You know, something new, something exciting is going to happen. Can we lead with you? And Jesus says, are you ready for this? Can you drink this cup? And like I said last Sunday, I feel like when we look at the life of the Grove, yes, it kind of has to do, we have a new building that's going to be done in October, but God often gives his people, his churches, and then you and me as individuals, new opportunities, new chapters. And so we want to wrestle with this question, are you ready for this as a church? And then personally and privately, are you ready for this spiritually? So open up to Luke chapter 22, and we want to continue in this series, Are You Ready for This? And this morning I want to talk about holding the cup, this cup that Jesus talked about that represents our life, your life, our lives. Luke 22, verse 39, Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, pray that you will not fall into temptation. He withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them and knelt down and prayed, Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, but yet not my will, but yours be done. Verse 43, an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him, and being in anguish, he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat was like drops of blood falling on the ground. When he rose from prayer and he went back to his disciples, he found them asleep, exhausted from sorrow. So Jesus here, he's in the garden with his friends. He says, this is going to get really tough. Would you pray with me? And then he says, God, take this cup. And so this cup, I said, this cup we'll be using as a metaphor over this series, represents in Hebrew culture, it represents our life, the life that God has given you to live. And Jesus, when he looks to the bottom of his cup, he looks at it and he says, this is just too bitter. I don't want to drink it. And he tries to hand it back to God. Jesus had been handed a cup of sorrow and bitterness. And here's where I want to go this morning, though, is that before we drink the cup, whatever cup of life God has given you, before you drink it, you must hold it. It's like that with most drinks that we're handed. Often we're people that want to jump straight to drinking it, and sometimes you have to hold it first and understand it and accept it and see what's inside of it. So today we'll be talking about holding the cup. It's kind of like this spring, Paul Gunther and a couple of others from the Grove, we were in Thailand, and we were trying to partner with some farmers that were doing community farming and community growing and fair trade, and they took us about 3 hours drive behind Chiang Mai up into the mountains where there was a coffee grower, and there was a plantation called the Soleil Plantation. And so we meet this Dutch farmer who's been there, this coffee grower who's been there for 25 years. And he shows us around where they're processing the coffee and where they're bagging the coffee, and he's telling us about his coffee. And then he says, would you like to come back to our house and taste and sample some of the coffee? And I go, yes, bingo, I'm in, I need some. And so we go back to his house. And like I said, he's been there for 25 years, way up in the mountains. He's built this wooden house with slats. You can see the ground right through the floor. It's just a really simple dwelling, so picture that. His son, I'm not making this up, lived in the tree house out back. His bedroom, he said that's his bedroom, right there in the tree. And the son had just left for college in Holland, but spent all his years living in a tree house. Anyway, that's where we were. So we're on the veranda, and he hands us a cup. His wife has poured some coffee. And as she hands us the cup of coffee, he says, would you just hold it for a few minutes? He said, don't drink it right away. He said, let me tell you about the coffee. Because most of us, we just want to jump right to the drinking. He says, hold it. And he starts to say, this is our pea berry coffee. He said, most coffee cherries have just a single bean inside of them. He said, but some, about 5% of coffee berries have 2 beans inside of them, and so they're called a pea berry. And he said the pea berry has a very distinct, unique taste. And so when we separate the beans by hand, when they're floating, our workers separate the pea berry aside. It's a very rare brew. And he said, so this is what I've prepared for you. He says, but the coffee has to cool down in your hands. After you know what you're about to drink, you can't just jump to it because if it's hot, you won't taste it right. So let's just hold it for a few minutes. And we want to jump straight to the drink, and I'm smelling it. I just want to drink it. And he says, hold it and understand. I wish I could have brought it back for you. He didn't have enough, or I'd brought you some of his pea berry. It was incredible. You see, we're a thirsty people. Today, though, is about holding the cup well that God has given, the cup of life that God has given you to live. The trouble is, sometimes we don't want to drink the cup that we've been given. Sometimes it's just like in Jesus' case, it just seems too bitter. Like Jesus' cup is a cup of sorrow, and he tries to give it back to God. Some cups, I understand, of life are more difficult to drink than others. Sometimes we wish we were like a baseball player who, when life gets really difficult, we could have a designated hitter who could drink our cup or hold our cup for us, but life isn't like that. I think sometimes we want to give the cup back to God. We want to put it on our shelf. Maybe it's a job has just gotten too difficult, or maybe a child is sick, or maybe you've been struggling with a sickness for years, or maybe you're caring for elderly parents, or maybe there's debt that won't go away, and the cup of life seems way too heavy and difficult and bitter, and you want to put it down or you want to give it back to God, but life isn't like that. Sometimes we want a different cup. It's not that just we don't want to drink it, but I think sometimes there's kind of an envy of life. If this represents life, sometimes we look at other people's cup, and let's be honest, we envy it. It seems like their kids leave home smiling and laughing in the morning, and they eat all of their breakfast and their vegetables at night. It seems like that. It seems like more other people get more time on the beach and more vacation and more leisure and pleasure, and so we envy. We could call it kind of like a cup envy, life envy. I've heard there's something called order envy in restaurants. Do you know that? You ever end up in a restaurant and it always seems like whoever you're with, they out-ordered you? And my wife, we ate somewhere a while ago, and it wasn't that long ago, but now every time we go out to dinner, she goes, so are you going to share with me tonight? Because here's what happened. I had ordered, she told me, I can't remember. She said, I ordered the macadamia nut chicken, and she ordered like soup or something like that. It could have been kale salad, something that's not going to fill you up or satisfy you. And she said the whole dinner she's looking at my macadamia nut chicken, and she kept complimenting me like, hey, that chicken looks so great. You know, what's it taste like, Palmer? Would you tell me about it? And I never picked up on the clue that she actually wanted some. And I just kept eating. And then to make it worse, she says that I only ate like half the chicken. And then I said we're out with another couple. That's why she said she couldn't ask me for it. And so I turned to the guy and I say, hey, Jay, you want the rest of my chicken? And he ate it in like 2 bites. And so now every time we go out, she goes, so you're going to finish that whole thing yourself, huh? That's order envy. And some of us look at people's life like that and we go, I wish I had their cup. I want a different cup. But that kind of comparing your cup to someone else's cup, it's fruitless. Because God has given you one cup of life to hold. Yours is a very unique cup. Like there are thousands of varieties of grape, there are thousands of varieties of lives to live. And the life that God has given you is not like anyone else's. And so, no, there's not a different cup for you. You must drink the cup that he's given you. The challenge today, the challenge that I want to leave with you by the end of the morning is for you to take this cup of your life that God has given you, and it's a precious and valuable life, and wrap both hands around it. In spite of the fact, like with Jesus' cup, you can see the bitterness and the sorrow floating on the top, and just hold it and go, okay, God, I'm willing to hold on to this. I don't want it. I wish it was someone else's, but it's yours. It's mine. And God has something incredible in it for you. Henry Nouwen has written on these ideas, and he's written a book, and fascinating short read titled, Can You Drink This Cup? And in it, he writes this. He writes, this is my life, the life God has given me to live as well as I possibly can. My life is unique. No one else will ever live it. I have my own history, my own family, my own body, my own personality, my own friends, my own way of speaking and doing things. I have my own life to live. This is my cup. Let's read that together. And I want you to read it along. And we'll just read it out loud. And we might stay together, we might not. It could be an absolute mess. So let's start with this. This is my life. The life God has given me to live as well as I possibly can. My life is unique. No one else will ever live it. I have my own history, my own family, my own body, my own personality, my own friends, my own way of speaking and doing things. I have my own life to live. This is my cup. And I hope by the end of this morning, you can hold on to that and embrace it and be okay with it and accept it. And more than accept it, thrive in this life that God has given you to live. And so I would start by asking you the simple question, so what is your cup? Is it safe to drink the cup that you hold? Is it good? Or is it bitter? Is it the cup you dreamed of holding, the life you dreamed of living? I'll start with this thought. So let's go back to Matthew 20. I want to go to the parallel passage in Luke, and that's in Matthew chapter 26. So turn there with me, and I want to say this next. Sometimes we end up holding what I'll describe this morning as the cup of sorrow. That just ends up, that's where Jesus was, and sometimes our cup feels like that. And so we read this in verse 36. Then Jesus went to his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to them, "Sit here while I go over there to pray." And he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. And he began to be sorrowful and troubled. Now understand, these are the two same brothers, the sons of thunder, who asked the original question, and he asked them back, "Can you drink this cup?" James and John, the sons of Zebedee. Verse 38, then he said to them, "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here and keep watch with me." Going a little further, he fell down with his face to the ground and prayed, "My Father, if it is possible, may this cup be taken from me, yet not as I will, but as you will," he says. There are some cups, like I said, in Jesus, we see it with him, that we do not want to drink. Jesus had asked James and John, "So can you drink this cup that I'm about to drink?" And they said, "Yes, you can." And he says back to them, "You have no idea what you're saying yes to, because my cup is a cup filled with sorrow and bitterness. And are you sure?" And they said, "Yes, we can." He says, "You don't know what you're saying." But this cup of sorrow that Jesus is holding is the cup of bitterness. And when it comes time for Jesus to drink the cup in the garden, first he tries to give it back to God. But then you have to look at the last verse in verse 47. Here's what he says. He went away a second time and prayed, "My Father, if it is not possible for the cup to be taken away unless I drink it," he says, "may your will be done." And so he holds his cup. He doesn't love this cup. When Judas comes to betray him, if you remember this scene in the garden, Peter draws a sword and he cuts off a guy's ear and he tries to stop it. And here's what Jesus says. Jesus says, "Put back your sword. Am I not to drink the cup the Father has given me?" And so he accepts the cup. As bitter and as hard and difficult as it is, he accepts it and he holds it and he's willing to drink it. I think there's a way to hold our cups well, the cup of life. Sometimes, like I said, we want to get rid of it. Some of us don't hold it so well, but sometimes even the cup of bitterness can be held very well. I want to invite Brad Sesmat to come up. Brad's been at the Grove for about 10 years. He was on Channel 3 for a long time doing their sports news. Now he's with AZ Sports 360. And I've heard him talk a number of times about a young woman from here in our community. Her name is Tiffany Tate. So Brad, thanks for coming back and chatting with us this morning. But you've interviewed Tiffany several times over the last couple of years. And tell us a little bit about her and her story and how, I know that her story is a difficult one, but she's held her cup of life so well, Brad.
Well, you're talking about cups. And so Tiffany's cup is cystic fibrosis. Tiffany is right here among us. She's a Chandler resident. Tiffany went to Chandler High School and did not tell her basketball coach, did not tell her teammates. Her mom told the basketball coach as she went through high school, Tiffany has CF. Tiffany ended up averaging 20 points per game. Tiffany was recruited by San Diego State, had to look the coach in the eye and say, I have CF. Basketball went by the wayside. Her lung capacity had dropped.
So because she tells them about what's in her cup, she doesn't get a D1 scholarship.
You're done.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wow.
So she has to move on and decides to get into coaching. She coaches over at Seton Catholic, an assistant girls basketball coach, and is terrific at it. You see the highlights of her. She was a flat-out player, great player. At Seton, her lung capacity dropped below 20%. That's where I met her and started doing the stories on her at Channel 3 and then over at Sports 360. And Tiffany had a double lung transplant 2 years ago. Tiffany went back to coaching at Seton Catholic. Tiffany had to have another double lung transplant because her body rejected the first set of double lungs. And this was 3 months ago. Tiffany's still coaching at Seton Catholic, and my friend Tiffany sent me a note a week ago saying, I need your address for you and your wife because I want you and Chris at my wedding.
That's awesome.
And Tiffany sent me a text after the first service to say, God is good, she's a strong Christian, and she lives right here among us. If she were up here on stage, you would never know. And that's the story of Tiffany.
Brad, thank you for sharing that. And I love how she's thriving and coaching with. Can we thank Brad for coming up this morning and love what he does in our community as well. And then the rest of the story is she needed twice she needed a double lung transplant, which was incredibly expensive. I loved hearing how our community, Brad talks about how even the Wisenhut family got behind her and helped her raise money to pay for that. And that kind of brings me to my next thought here is that sometimes this cup of life gets so heavy or it's so bitter that we need others to help us hold on to our cup. And that's just not me saying that, that's actually what happened with Jesus. So when we go back to this passage in Matthew 26, we read in verse 37, he took Peter and the two sons of Zebedee along with him. So he's going into the garden and he's going there to pray, we read. And he began to be sorrowful and full of trouble. And then he said to them, my soul is overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. Stay here. And then underline this in your Bible. Stay here and keep watch with me. He brings these three friends with him and he says, I can't hold this cup anymore on my own. And I need you here to hold it with me. This cup of sorrow or bitterness, sometimes we can't hold it so well on our own. And even Jesus said, I need someone to help me hold it with me. A few hours later, he ends up dragging his cross through the streets of Jerusalem. And that gets heavy, and he can't carry that so well by himself. And so they stop, and a young man by the name of Simon from Cyrene, which is Libya, an African, they said, could you come help him carry his cross? He couldn't even carry his own cross on his own, and that's okay, because God has created something called the church. And we have a place here called the Grove, and that's one of the reasons he's invited us to come together so we don't have to hold our cups of life by ourselves anymore. At the Grove, you heard Scott talk earlier about our life groups, and we formed life groups so that people can come together and not just study the Bible together, but meet the needs of each other. I love hearing the stories that come out of our life groups. Like over the last few months, I've heard the story play out of one young mother here at the Grove. And about a year, maybe it's almost 2 years ago, her husband left her and she ended up being alone. And so last year she was alone raising 2 kids. And she needed to sell her house, but it seemed impossible because she said the house a lot of it was in disrepair. There were holes in the drywall. The fence was falling down. The pump in the pool wasn't working. It was green. She said she didn't even know how to start a lawnmower. And so the grass was like up to here. She wasn't in this life group, but one of our life groups heard that there was a mother with 2 kids by herself that needed some help. And so when she left town, they invaded her house and they had like a home makeover while she was gone. And they came in and they repainted walls and they fixed the fences and they cleaned out the pool and got the pump running and they mowed the lawn. And then they spread rock around the house. And when she came home, it looked beautiful and stunning. That's one life group. They spent like 14 hours there that day. Because that's sometimes when our cups get so heavy or so bitter, we don't want to hold them on our own. And so God has given us the church, his people that come around. The rest of the story goes on at Christmas, this last Christmas. There's 12 days before Christmas, and so this life group came alongside this young mother, and each of the 12 days, I don't know what gifts you give. Someone tell me after this service. Partridge in a pear tree? I don't know. I don't think they gave her a partridge, but for the 12 days of Christmas, they showed up at her house with a different gift. And then the story gets even better because about 3 weeks ago, this young single mother got married on the beach in San Diego. And now she's come back with her husband, and she just told me they joined that life group. And you see, that's how the church is meant to be. That's how when some cups are so bitter, so heavy, we can't carry them on our own, God gives us Christ's followers around us who are there to love us. And then something surprising with Jesus, his cup is getting so bitter and so heavy, his friends are falling asleep. But look at what God does, because even he needed someone alongside him in the garden. In Luke 22, verse 43, we read, an angel from heaven appeared to him and strengthened him. So God sees that this cup is just too much for Jesus to hold on his own. So he sends an angel from heaven. You have to underline that in your Bible. And I want to remind you this morning that God has more angels in heaven. And he's still sending them down. Maybe they come in the form of a life group that shows up when you feel desperate. But God has more angels in heaven to send to earth. Sometimes our cup, I'll say next, fills with blessing and joy. So it's not just a bitter cup. It's just not cups of sorrow that God gives us, but sometimes he gives us the best cups. King David in Psalm 23, he writes about a cup of sorrow, but then he writes about the cup of blessing and joy. Do you remember this in Psalm 23:5? He says, my cup is overflowing. God is doing so many good things in my life. It's like that. And so our cup is often, yes, there's bitterness and sorrow, but if life was just a cup of bitterness and sorrow, then this life would be unbearable, wouldn't it? And so Jesus knows that in his cup is also, there's a cup of joy. He can see that what we can't see. He can see all the way to the bottom. And yes, on the surface, there's some sorrow floating there, but he knows that there's some joy and happiness in there. And here's what he knows, that yes, he may die, he will die on a cross. But then because he dies on the cross, there's this joy that lasts for eternity for all of humanity, because his death and resurrection rescues us from our mortal state. That's what happens. And so this cup of sorrow for Jesus is also a cup of joy. And the good news is he can see to the bottom, and so he's willing to hold it. David goes on, this is Psalm 116, verse 13. I will lift up the cup of salvation and praise the Lord's name for saving me. The last thought that I want to leave with you this morning is, whatever cup you have been given to hold, my invitation at the end of this morning will be to kneel and to accept it and to hold it. Sometimes the only way to hold the cup well that God has given us is to first kneel. We read this about Jesus, so we go back to verse 41 in Luke 22. We read, he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, and we read this, he knelt down and prayed. The cup was way too much for him to hold, so he drops to his knees and he prays. Kneeling, I think there's two important things, and if you're writing anything down, write this down this morning. When you kneel, two critical things happen. One, you're pleading with someone, and in this case, Jesus is pleading with God. But then two, you're submitting to whatever they decide. And you're submitting to the sovereignty of God to say, this cup, this life, I will accept it. That's what happens, I think, when you kneel. It's kind of like this. This is a picture that comes to my head. Last month, just in June. What month are we? We're in August, so it was a little more than a month ago. I met my twin brother with our sons in Brazil. So I was flying from Phoenix, and he lives in East Africa, and he was flying from Malawi, and he was going to meet me there. And Paul says that, his name is Paul, he gets on the plane, he was going through immigration, when the immigration officer, when he's leaving Malawi, said, what kind of passport is this? And he realizes that he had brought the wrong passport. He brought his temporary passport, not the passport with a Brazilian visa stamped in it. That was on his Xerox machine back at the house. So she stamped him, and he heads for the plane, but he knows once he gets to Johannesburg, he won't be able to board the plane for Brazil. So he calls a friend back and he says, hey, you got to break into my house, kick the door down and get the passport, and you've got to fly to the airport. It's like 20 minutes. And he's on his way boarding the plane at this point, walking up the stairs. And he gets on the plane and he's looking at his watch, and the guy's still 15 minutes away, and the plane is supposed to leave in 5 minutes. So he does what all of us would have done. He goes up to the cockpit and he knocks on the door, and the pilots open the door, and he brings his 2 sons with him. All 3 of them are wearing the USA home jersey, the red, white, and blue jersey, all 3 of them. And he comes in and he says, hey, he said, please. He said, I have a friend bringing my passport. We're on our way to the World Cup. Please, just wait 15 minutes. And the pilot says, man, my on-time record is going to be damaged. Plus, some of the passengers have connecting flights, and you're going to make them miss them possibly. And so now he's desperate. So he does again what all of us would have done. He dropped to his knees. He said he got down on his knees in the cockpit between the captain and co-pilot, and he's pleading, please, look at the children, look at the children. And they waited. And you're at the mercy of the pilot, and the pilot waited 50. Yes, people in first class were yelling and screaming, but they waited until they came. Kneeling, when you get down, 1, you're pleading, but 2, you're saying, I'm at the mercy, of the pilot or of God. And God, whatever you have for my life, I will live it, and I will live it well. When you look at the Bible, every person who was ever desperate before God, you know what they ended up doing? They dropped to their knees. I wrote down a few. These are just a few. The list could be a page long. Genesis 17, Abraham fell face down. Moses, we read, when the bush is burning, falls face down to the ground. David, 1 Chronicles 29, fell face down. Ezekiel 1, when I saw the Lord, I fell face down. Daniel 10, I bowed my face toward the ground. Revelation 1, Paul says, when I saw him, I fell at his feet. And so this morning, I'm going to invite you in just a few minutes to kneel. I don't think we do that enough as Christians, or as Christians at the Grove. We forget about the practice of kneeling before God and saying, God, help me to hold this cup and to hold it well. I shared last Sunday, just at the top, that this phrase, are you ready for this? I kind of borrowed it from the one-day passion movement that years ago, Louis Giglio invited college students from around the country on one Sunday to meet in a field. And as they're driving out there, they were asked this question at checkpoints, are you ready for this? Well, when they got there for this one day of worship, 50,000 students, Matt Redman is leading a time of worship towards the end of the day. And Matt Redman starts playing this song, The Wonderful Cross. You can turn up the sound just a little bit. And as he's playing The Wonderful Cross, these 2 college guys, I don't know if they tied this to the top of their Volkswagen Bug, but they showed up with a cross. And then they start carrying it to the front of where the stage was on a hill, and they hold it there. And then this is a 13-minute video. We're not watching the whole thing. But then not just a few people come, but first tens and then hundreds and maybe even a couple of thousand come around the cross and kneel and pray. And I share this because my hope is that every day this is your posture. Because when you kneel, the posture of your heart changes. I have a few things. We're going to have to end this and put on the screen. There's a few things that I wanted to share with you, that when you kneel, when you move to that posture, then when I'm on my knees, it no longer is about me. It's no longer about you. It's about what God wants you to do, and it's about Him. We usually don't kneel maybe because we want height, not depths. We want to be higher, not lower. But kneeling puts us in a right place. When I kneel, when I'm on my knees, I usually need help, and that's the case with Jesus here. And when the cup feels bitter or heavy, then my invitation is to kneel. When I'm on my knees, I've stopped. I've stopped being in charge. I've stopped hurrying and rushing. We're busy, hurried people. You can't hurry on your knees. You can't boss people around on your knees. You can't order people to do anything on your knees. But when you're on your knees, you can be silent. You can be still. You can have intimacy with God. And finally, when I'm on my knees, I can finally hold the cup that God has given me. I can finally accept the cup because I'm submitting and I'm saying, okay, God, you know that some of this I don't want to. I can't see that the joy and the blessing at the bottom, all I see floating at the top is the bitterness and the sorrow. But when I'm on my knees, then I can submit and say, okay, but you are in charge, and I understand that. So here's how we want to end our service this morning. We're going to take communion. And we want to invite you to come and take communion. Now, we have communion tables like this one in the front and the one in the back. And we want to invite you to, you can take communion as we always take communion in the morning, on Sunday mornings. Or for the first time at the Grove, we have stations here and a station here and a station here where you can kneel. And we have some of our pastors and our elders will come and serve you communion. They will come first with the bread, and they will give you a piece of bread, and just take it and hold it. And then one of our pastors or elders will come with a cup, and then you can dip your bread in the cup and take communion that way. We haven't done that at the Grove yet. I don't know why, but we need to, because this posture of kneeling to take the cup and the bread as Jesus did, I think is important. It's an important reminder. This bread, Jesus says, we read in Luke chapter 22:19, he took the bread and he broke it, and he says, this is my body given for you. This bread represents the body of Christ, that he broke it and gave it to his followers, and then he gave his life for you. And then we read in Luke 22, verse 20, he took the cup, and he said, this cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you, and for you, and for you. And so this cup represents the blood of Christ that was shed for you. And so as Christians, he says, come together. When you come together, remember me and take the bread and take the cup and remember that I was here. Remember my work on the cross, that I died and I rose again, to give you this joy and blessing life for eternity.